For all its widespread use, immersion is a term that is still the subject of debate in the academia, and a consensus with regards to what the concept entails remains to be reached. While far from attempting to establish once and for all what immersion means, I hope that by factoring in research in the fields of post-classical narratology, presence theory, media studies, and game studies, I might come up with a view on immersion that accounts for the objective technological medium-specific affordance, the subjective impression of being there, and the cultural constructedness of the impression of being there. As my arguments unfold, I shall refer to the survival horror video game Silent Hill 2. The purpose of the analysis is double-folded. On the one hand, I want to reveal the relevance of the concept for the production of video games, while on the other hand, I also want to use the video game in order to enhance our understanding of immersion, especially in what concerns the importance of the cultural constructedness of our perception of something as being real, authentic, or immediate. So what is immersion? When discussing immersion, one can distinguish two schools of thought. One that claims that only interactive media are immersive, and another that claims that all media are more or less immersive. Not surprisingly, these two sides correspond to the two-faceted definition of immersion. If we define immersion as a technological affordance, then immersion is the ability to actively influence the often fictional world remotely, thus obtaining telepresence or presence. If, on the other hand, we regard immersion as the psychological effect of being there created by the techno-narrative affordances of particular media, then immersion is the illusion of presence and, optionally, the ability to influence the fictional world. This latter, more generous approach is also endorsed by narrative theorists such as David Herman, who claims that narrative world-making means cohabiting the same world with the author. Earlier, for instance, Monika Fludernik asserted that reflector narratives are immersive. My thesis endorses the second, more generous definition of immersion and maintains that the technology of telepresence heightens the psychological impression of being immersed in another world. This implies that immersion is a gradient category, i.e., some narrative cultural products are more immersive than others. Understanding immersion presupposes looking at its two intimately related dimensions, immediacy and interactivity. While the former is the fundamental condition of immersion and arguably in non-ergodic, non-interactive media, immediacy and immersion can be regarded as one and the same thing, in the case of ergodic and interactive media, the level of immersion should increase with the level of interactivity. Immersion in this paper is a variable which in itself is the sum of two other variables, immediacy and interactivity. Probably the most popular narrative medium which thrives on immediacy and interactivity is video games. In what follows, I shall investigate the survival horror classic Silent Hill 2. My analysis will be divided into two. I will be looking at aspects of interactivity and then at aspects of immediacy. Before commencing, I would like to mention from early on that the separate treatment of the two does not suggest that the two dimensions of immersion are isolated from one another. Quite on the contrary, the two strongly and mutually influence one another. According to Murray-Lorion, interactivity is a gradient category whose level can be established by cross-matching the four categories of interactivity based on two criteria: the position of the player inside or outside the game world, and the ability, or lack thereof, to influence the game world. This way we get internal or external interactivity and, on the other hand, ontological or exploratory interactivity. In the case of Silent Hill 2, we are dealing with a case of internal ontological interactivity, which is the highest degree of interactivity. In the game, you control James Sunderland, who has to make his way through a ghost town filled with monsters resembling his or the other character's traumatic memories. James also has to solve a lot of puzzles, an activity reminiscent of mystery video games such as mist. What is highly relevant for the ontological aspect of interactivity in Silent Hill 2 is the influence that the player's acts can have on determining the ending. Silent Hill 2 has 6 endings that can be triggered by choosing a particular narrative branch throughout the game. Yet what is interesting is that these narrative nodes, that lead to these branches are concealed, and the person playing Silent Hill 2 for the first time without knowledge of the game design is likely to be unaware of the decision-making points. A deeper insight into the issue of plot is required here. Like most horror-themed action-adventure games, Silent Hill 2 has a rigid scripted story that leaves the player room for narrative input only in between narrative nodes, which are usually marked by cinematic cutscenes. You can dodge or kill monsters, you can take the short or long way, discover the chainsaw or not, yet progress depends on the players reaching a particular checkpoint which pushes the narrative forward. Yet Silent Hill 2 is, or better yet used to be, different from other games released around that period, that is 2001, in that the actions of the player in between two nodes also determine the selection of a particular pre-established narrative script. How can we relate this aspect of interactivity to immediacy then? In real life, we obviously have more freedom than in video games such as Silent Hill 2. The limited control options and plot developments are so unlike real life that they highlight the artificiality of the video game, thus making it hypermedial. Or it would seem so. In fact, I tend to claim the pre-scripted nature of the plot in Silent Hill 2 and other video games ensures that the game entertains a high degree of narrativity, which then maintains a strong narrative engagement with the game. Were this not the case, the game would become boring. In the absence of player narrative engagement actually, the mediated nature of the gaming experience is highlighted, and immediacy turns to hypermediacy. Obviously, a game designer is coerced to choose the lesser of two evils. Either limit the possibilities and stress how little freedom you have in a game that pursues a particular narrative profile. And this is very important, particular narrative profile, because my argument is not applicable to process-oriented video games. Or loosen the script as much as possible and lose the narrative design, bore the player, which in the end once again leads to hypermediacy. So far I have looked into the issue of interactivity. It's now time to address that of immediacy. First, what is immediacy? Immediacy is the desire of media to erase their mediation, to give the audience the impression that they are actually experiencing the authentic thing. In the case of fictional narratives, instead of the real thing, the goal is to trick the audience into believing that they are experiencing the real, authentic, text-actual world, to quote Morgan Orion. Intimately related to the issue of immediacy is that of narration. Each narrative has a narrator function which manipulates the techno-narrative affordances of the medium in order to convey the story in its plot form. This is true of all narratives, irrespective of their medium. The narrator, therefore, is in itself a medium working on a content level whose obvious presence works against the logic of immediacy. The more obvious the narrator is, the more obvious the artificial means used to tell the story become. Conversely, the less obvious the narrator is, or the fewer the manipulations of the story are by the narrator function, the more immediate a narrative becomes. However, there is a limit to how little story content can be manipulated, or, to be more precise, how little the manipulation of the story content can be concealed. In order to illustrate this idea, let us focus on the issue of temporality. It is already an established fact in narrative theory that narratives feature a sujet and a fabula, also known as plot and story, which are linked to discourse time and story time respectively. Discourse time is a clear example of artificiality because it highlights the mediated nature of the narrative through flashbacks, anticipations, contractions, and so on. While some media are better at hiding the manipulation of temporality than others, see film cuts versus comic book panels, It goes without saying that time manipulation exists in all media, including drama for that matter. If the gap between discourse time and event time, or plot and story, is a trait of artificiality that flaunts the immediate and, I dare say, immersive character of narratives, then bridging the gap between the two would seem the obvious solution to enhancing immediacy and immersion. Unfortunately, the presupposed higher degree of immediacy and immersion would come at a cost, namely that of tellability and playability in the case of video games. Moreover, low tellability and playability backfire and in the end reduce the level of immediacy and immersion by revealing the artificial nature of the narrative. So, if a narrative has a low level of tellability and playability, the process of reception leads to a low degree of engagement, which raises awareness to the mediation, hence artificiality, of the narrative. As a result, instead of increasing the level of immediacy and immersion of a narrative, fully concealing or doing away with the narrator function decreases the level of the two. Let's have a look at a few examples. If a novel described each and every gesture of a character coupled with the associated psychonarration, as it has been tried in experimental trends in novel writing such as Le Nouveau Roman, as far as I remember, the novel would become almost unreadable. Furthermore, its very status as a narrative would be challenged and the novel would be more similar to a description. Or, if in a sandbox role-playing game such as Fallout 3, one would have to literally spend 8 hours while the playable character sleeps, or would have to literally traverse the wasteland from one location to another in the absence of the fast travel option, the game would be boring and unplayable. Standing 8 hours in front of the monitor will undoubtedly remind the gamer of the mediated nature of the gaming experience. In Silent Hill 2, we are faced with the same attempt to conceal the narrator function. In a video game, it is important to note that the narrator function is controlled by both the player and the game designer. In fact, the player controls the narrator function only in as much as the game designer allows her. I would even go as far as to argue that the logic of immediacy in a video game would be to trick the player into believing that she is controlling the playable character when in fact she's also controlling the narrator function. When executing the video game, the console or computer becomes a storytelling device. You manipulate the device into conveying the story the way you want it in the limits imposed by the game designers. Moreover, as in the examples presented above, the player freely manipulates temporality by pausing the story every time she checks her inventory in Silent Hill 2, or in order to choose an item or a weapon. When playing Silent Hill 2, you determine a particular unfolding of the plot and a particular presentation of the game actual world, which means that you, the player, fulfill the narrator function. You control James Sunderland, but you sometimes also control the camera angle from which you view James Sunderland. Yet what the game tries to do is convince you that your control of James Sunderland is not mediated. In order to achieve this, the game remediates an already established medium whose artificial means of manipulating and presenting the story have been naturalized by the global audience, the feature film. And now I'm going to show you 2 clips. The first clip is a walkthrough of the first few minutes of the video game. It contains a pre-rendered cinematic cutscene, a cutscene generated by the game engine, and actual gameplay. And then I will present to you another cutscene from later on in the video game, which is very relevant for the relationship between video games and the history of cinema. Let's see if I can manipulate this machine properly now.
restless dreams. I see that town.
Okay, and now the second cutscene, which I'm gonna present it from the very beginning. What I want to highlight in this cutscene is the way remediating film also brings along a lot of, say, film history. What we will be seeing here is an almost intertextual relationship to a whole history in film about representing, the peeping Tom, scopophilia. And I personally, when I saw this cutscene, I couldn't help thinking about David Lynch's Blue Velvet and the famous peeping Tom scene. So what is remediation? Remediation is the process by which a medium incorporates another medium by imitating the latter's techno-narrative affordances with the purpose of attaining a higher degree of immediacy. Silent Hill 2 remediates film by employing many cuts, fixed camera angles, continuity editing, extensive cutscenes, and acting. To be sure, film and video games have always been intimately connected. Some have even called video games interactive films. Yet Silent Hill 2 is far more filmic than many other previous video games. In fact, at the turn of the millennia, video games are becoming more and more cinematic. See Max Payne, Hitman, and their subsequent sequels. Film is a highly popular medium whose grammar has come to be culturally associated with immediacy. The spread of television and cinema around the globe has created a new type of literacy that is very unlikely for someone not living in a remote, underdeveloped region not to master. Because film language is now the dominant, maybe not the only one, definitely, but one of the dominant immediacy codes, it is natural for video games seeking a high degree of immediacy and immersion to want to employ film language. Nevertheless, I would tend to claim that using the third person so as to show the protagonist as in a film, as well as providing him with a backstory, impinges on the degree to which the player can identify with the character. In a first-person view and with a nameless, storyless main protagonist, it was easier for the player to project herself into the void personality container which the playable character was. And I'm 20 minutes sharp. Thank you very much.